I went home tired that day, so tired that I was like a dead man ready to fall over into his grave at the slightest change in direction of wind. Tired enough to die. That tired. I drove my old clunker down the highway in a daze, with half my brain in a fantasy world and the other half in the real world. Then, the dream of the vampiressa started to slowly creep its way back into my subconsciousness. Her black silk hair and shiny eyes appeared in my mind's eye. Then the vision turned into Francie's face. The tantalizing apparition relaxed the muscles in my neck and I started to doze off. My hands slowly loosened their grip around the steering wheel and I felt the car's tires shudder as it began to veer off the main road. The next thing I remembered was waking up in a hospital bed with Mr. Mendoza and Johnny standing over me. "Pete, can you hear me?" Johnny whispered. I just stared at him like he wasn't really standing there in front of me. Every time I tried to move my left arm, a sharp pain shot up to my neck. I felt something stuck on my right hand, pulling at my skin every time I tried to bend my wrist. "Be careful, Pete," Mr. Mendoza said softly. "You don't want to pull out the IV again, do you?" I tried to swallow, but I had no spit in my mouth. Mr. Mendoza noticed this and said to Johnny, "Give him some water. I think he's thirsty." Johnny put the cup to my lips and said, "Man, Pete, we thought that you were going to die." The water ran down my throat and I forced myself to talk. My voice was hoarse when I asked, What happened?" "You had an accident in your car," Mr. Mendoza explained. "You hit a telephone pole, Pete. When you hit the pole, your forehead was gashed open. It took 32 stitches to sew it back up. You lost a lot of blood, Pete. Johnny and I were going to donate some, but we didn't match up to your blood type. Luckily, they had plenty of plasma in the blood bank here at the hospital." "Why can't I move my left arm without it hurting so bad?" I asked him, slightly grimacing. "It's broken," he replied. What else happened to me?" I groaned. "You've been out for 2 full days, Pete," Mr. Mendoza said. "The doctors didn't know how long you'd be out. Everyone at the restaurant has been praying for you to wake up and be okay." "You'll be okay now, Pete," Johnny said. "You should be going home in about 2 or 3 days," Mr. Mendoza said, smiling. "At least that's what the doctors have said." "Hey, Pete, guess what?" Johnny smiled. "I don't know, what?" "Chewie and Rhonda have named their baby girl after you." "Really?" "Yeah, they're calling her Pierta." The nurse came into the room and said, "Time for your medication." "Well, we better be going, Pete. We'll come back and see you tomorrow, okay?" Mr. Mendoza said. I shook my head and said, "Okay." After 1,000,000 visits from friends and family and 1,000,001 visits from my father and mother, I finally went home on the 3rd day. My house was just as I had left it, quiet and dusty. I noticed that my bed sheets were clean and all of my clothes were clean and folded. "Mother Escobedo," I thought to myself. "Mom, I love you." I lied down on my bed. A sharp object poked me from underneath one of the sheets. It was Francie's gift, the astrological book. I propped myself up on my right arm and started to flip through the pages. The metronome sat quietly on my dresser, but even in the silence I heard the tick-tick in my head. Soon I was asleep. I dreamt that it was noon and I was out in the desert somewhere. There was no life around me. I was all alone. The wind whipped up mounds of sand and dirt into my face, blinding me as I tried to walk through it. The sun's heat was beating down on me from overhead, making my left arm throb in its cast. I walked on. Then the desert disappeared and I stood alone in naked darkness. The darkness started to crack and give way all around me, letting bright white lights shine through the openings. I felt an intense heat from the lights like it was the desert hiding behind all the darkness. But then I noticed that the darkness wasn't cracked at all. Rather, the edges were soft and rounded, like puzzle pieces. A giant galactic puzzle surrounded me. Pictures of the restaurant came into view. Johnny, Lupe, and little Noah, Mr. Mendoza, Concha Ramirez, my parents, our old house we used to live in many years ago, the stars in the evening sky, everything, like the entire world could be viewed from every angle around me. Then it faded away and the darkness returned. The pieces shifted again and more light came through, blazing at me from all directions. The puzzle was falling apart and trying to take me with it. My heart pounded like a hammer in my chest as I began to run from the shattered pieces. The darkness began to disintegrate as the white lights took over in its place. A loud drum sounded in the distance, but it wasn't a drum at all. It was the pieces falling into a pit somewhere behind me. I stopped running and looked behind me for a second. The white light was racing toward me. It consumed my entire body and I started to burn from its intense heat. I felt myself slowly dying, being burned to death, and then I woke up. My pillow was soaking wet with sweat. I wiped my face with my shirt and a cold chill came over me. At that very instant, I wanted to talk to someone. I wanted someone to knock at my door and say, "I'm here to hold you in your hour of need, because I care about you. I'm happy that you're alive." But, like always, I was alone. I looked at the metronome sitting on top of my dresser and thought to myself, "You're a lucky little ticker, aren't you? You never feel despair, anger, or loneliness, do you? No, you just perform your basic function, ticking away." Remember that part I said earlier about how the metronome tends to soothe a troubled and tired mind, but then how sometimes it's just a useless piece of metal and wood, unable to dispel the dark and evil thoughts of a person's subconsciousness? Well, that was what I felt at that very moment, ready to throw the tick-tick machine out the window through the glass and all. I got out of bed, walked over to the dresser, and picked up the metronome. The wood and steel was cold in my hand as I felt it over. Then my thoughts of evil rage subsided as I set the machine down. I flicked the steel rod with my finger and it began to tick-tick back and forth, over and over again, like the eternal rhythm of time. Or better yet, like the eternal rhythm of a game being slowly played out. Just then a knock sounded on my door and I went to answer it. "Mr. M, what are you doing out so late?" I asked, opening the door for him to enter. "It's not that late yet, is it?" I stretched my neck to see the clock on my television set. "No, I suppose not. It's only 7 o'clock. "Oh, good. That means I haven't missed the last bus yet," he replied. "What's up, Mr. M?" "May I sit down, Pete? It's been a long day and I'm very tired." "Sure, come in. Take a seat on the couch or the chair. Would you like a cold drink of water or something?" "No, Pete, thank you," he replied, putting his face in his hands. "What's wrong, Mr. M? Has anything happened at the restaurant?" He sat there in silence and didn't say a word. I took a seat in the chair across from him and said, "You look like someone just died." "Someone did." "Who?" "Concha." He said this like his entire soul had just been stripped from him. "What?" "Mr. M, I'm sorry." "What happened to her?" "Well, you know how it goes when you get old, Pete. The world's in your hands when you're a youth, and then the next time you turn around, poof, it's gone. And the funny thing is, you forget it all anyway. Everything you learned your whole life, that is. And what is important is nothing at all." "How did she die?" "Heart attack." "Well, it was partially a heart attack that killed her, just as much as it was the bullet that pierced her shoulder. The bullet severed a major artery and she almost bled to death. The ambulance got her to the hospital on time, but her heart was too weak and she fell into a coma. She died just this morning." "Does her family know?" I asked him. "Oh yes, they were there when she died. She just didn't wake up, Pete." "I take it a funeral's already been planned?" "Yes, tomorrow. Her family's taking her back to Mexico for burial. I'm leaving with Johnny and Lupe tonight." "Mr. M, I know not many people liked her or the way she ran things at the restaurant." "Yes, I know. I was one of them, Pete. But nobody wanted her to die, you know. Did the police ever find out who shot up the restaurant?" "What? Oh no, they didn't yet. They probably never will find out who did it, you know. I guess it doesn't matter now. Mr. M, would you like me to come along and—" "No, Pete, it's not necessary. Besides, you have to heal up some more. You haven't fully recovered yet." He pointed at my bum arm. "But I don't mind. I'm sure my job will let me take off for a funeral." "I'll be fine, thanks, Pete. Well, I had planned to come over here to see how you were doing and try to make you feel better, but instead I end up bringing only more misery." "I'm glad you told me, Mr. M. I guess the restaurant's closed now." "See, for good this time. No more chili relleno. I don't think that anyone in her family wants to keep it open. Almost all of her family and relatives live in Mexico, and I don't think they'll move to America just to run a restaurant." "Well, I guess I better be going, Pete. After all, I wouldn't want to miss the last bus home." He held out his hand and I shook it and said, "Okay, Mr. M, take care of yourself. I'll see you when you get back home from the funeral in Mexico." "Well, Pete, it won't be too soon. I plan on staying there for a little while." "How long?" "I don't know yet. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month. I don't know. I've got my sick leave and vacation time built up at the bank, so I figured I'd take it now while I still could, you know." "Well, then I'll see you when you get back, whenever that may be." "I need my time, Pete." And with that said, he walked out the door and the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I watched as Mr. Mendoza walked down the road toward the bus stop. The evening air had a slight chill in it as I looked up at the stars. True, I was alone again. No Chiliriano to visit every morning, with all of the people I grew to call friends. That section of my life was over, and it was time for me to move on. Except I didn't know what to do next. Get married? Have 3 kids? No way, not yet, maybe never, I thought, laughing at myself as I looked down at the grass for the first time in a long time. I have time, all the time in the world.